I know.
Hi, friends, especially our younger friends. Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Just going to give it a few more seconds. Okay, well, again, good evening, everyone. I am Dr. Leslie Torres Rodriguez. I am the proud superintendent of Harvard Public Schools, and I want to welcome you all with a special hello to members of our school governance councils who are joining us tonight. And of course, for your service to our school communities. Know that having your voice, perspective, and commitment to our schools makes our district a very special place, and it helps us get better in service of our students. So I appreciate your partnership. Everyone that is joining us tonight, gratitude to you as well for being here. This is our very first of several budget conversations. This year's budget cycle is going to be especially complex as we all determine how we should, move forward with spending decisions, with revenue challenges, especially with the expiration of our COVID relief funds, which have helped us to establish a foundation, some foundational elements of our programming, and lots of supports for our students.
Buenas tardes a todos los que necesitan interpretación en español. Para los seminarios web por Zoom, por favor, haga clic en el enlace de Zoom que se le envió. Vamos a estar utilizando la interpretación, la función de interpretación de Zoom esta noche para proporcionar la presentación en español. Cuando entra al seminario, va a ver en su pantalla hacia el lado derecho, en la parte de abajo, un botón que parece un globo terráqueo. Usted puede darle clic a esa imagen y entonces en esa imagen va a haber 3 opciones. La primera va a decir audio original, la segunda va a decir inglés y la tercera va a decir español. Le va a dar clic a la opción en español y una vez le dé clic a esa opción en español, va a tener la opción de darle, de silenciar completamente el audio original o dejar el audio original en la parte de atrás. Yo les recomiendo que silencien el audio original, pero si quieren escuchar un poco lo que están hablando en inglés, pues puede hacerlo. Una vez haga eso, va a estar viendo exactamente la presentación que todos vamos a estar viendo, pero va a estar escuchando a nuestra intérprete en el área de español.
Gracias, señorita Alvarado. Thank you so much, Ms. Alvarado, for those instructions. So just want to touch base that we will have Q&A and question and answers. Some of the questions that we've previously heard regarding the budget process, we've tried to address those through the content that you're going to see in the presentation tonight. Other questions that were submitted also ahead of tonight's event, when you registered, we'll try to address those that are more unique in terms of specific topics. So we can, we'll have some time at the end to answer some of those questions. And if we can't get to all of the questions, we will make sure that we answer them and then submit them to everyone. So to set the table for this meeting, we're going to give a summary of our current budget situation, including our budget timeline and the roles of our SGC members. We'll also review all of the components and the purpose of what we call our equity starter budget, which is essentially how we allocate funding to schools. And then I'll tag in Deputy Superintendent Paul Foster to give a summary on the development of the fiscal year 25 budget, right? That's the next budget that we're going to build, and the implications, right? The challenges given the expiration of the COVID relief funding. And we're going to use a term called ESSER. ESSER also means the COVID relief funding, the grant that we got to help us mitigate with the pandemic impact. So after that, then we'll get into the questions that were submitted in advance of the meeting. So most of you perhaps have seen this slide. This is just a quick overview of our, what we call the District Model of Excellence, the DME, and our Strategic Operating Plan, which is now in the final of 3 years. This was our plan to promote academic excellence, emotional recovery, and social emotional well-being using the COVID relief funding, right, that we're going to use to term ESSER. The mission hasn't changed. Our mission is to provide all of our students with the learning and the supports they need to succeed in school, but also in life, right? These are the supports that are that we try to make it specific to each student, because we know that students have unique needs and unique skills. And then the vision, right? Where it is that we ultimately want to get to is so that all students can graduate prepared to transform our world, because we believe that all of our students are highly capable. And the plan comprises 4 major priorities that you see there, right? So high quality teaching and learning, ensuring that we have a welcoming culture and nurturing climate for everyone, engaging families and our community partners, and then making sure that we have skillful staff and effective operations. So this is what has driven us forward over the last 2 years, and will continue to guide us through this academic year and beyond. The budget process supports the implementation of the district model for excellence and those priorities, and a more positive experience for school leaders, their school communities. And it has been designed in response to some of the feedback from stakeholders about the budget development process. Some of the aspirations, this is work that we did a few years ago when we wanted to make the budget process better, given that many of you were giving us feedback on ways that we can make it better. And some of the things that we had heard directly from some of you, from our community members, was about transparency. And that was a priority recognized specifically by our SGCs, and is one of the major goals of, forums like this one. Schools should understand exactly how resources are allocated to their schools. Equity was something else that we heard, and really is at the core of what we do. And it was specifically identified by parents, right? Some schools receive funding. Our schools receive funding specifically consistent with the level of need that students have. And so some schools' funding might look different depending on the level of need. We also heard timeliness and flexibility. This was actually something that our school leaders identified as a pain point. Our school principals wanted to know specifically, they wanted clear outlines about what is flexibility, what is the flexibility that they have to add or remove staff. What else could they do that was unique with their budget? And they also wanted us to start this process earlier so that they could hire staff and assign teachers earlier. Over the years, we have improved on all of these. There's another one that we heard, and that was about stability. And we had schools that were concerned making sure that every budget cycle kind of set us up for continued success and for stability in programming in future years. So those were some of the examples that I just raised for a few minutes, because it's important that we continue to check in with all of you to see what your experience is when we're building the budget, and that we continue to improve upon it. This is a quick glance into the calendar and the specific components of our budget development process and the key dates that we have to look forward to. We're sharing this to make sure that, okay, one, it's on your radar, and also to make sure everyone understands that this is a comprehensive approach that we're going to take with developing the budget. One of the most important aspects of that approach, and it has been to me for years, is engaging our stakeholders, engaging feedback, getting your perspective. And of course, that includes your voices as parents and as SGC members, our school leaders, our union leadership, our Board of Education, and the community at large. We're going to make sure that we promote these opportunities for engagement, and that you also help us to encourage others to participate. And we're excited to hear your feedback. Our plan is to have a final sign off on of the budget on March 8th from SGCs, with the board adopting the budget on March 19th. And then you can see here on the slide, right, all the other dates that kind of working backwards. So while the SGCs do not have a final vote on the budget proposal, they play an incredibly important part in the process. After the school leaders, right, receive their starter budget from our central office team, they then review with staff, with SGCs, to gather that feedback and design a budget aligned to the district priorities and of course the school needs. And SGCs provide valuable feedback and help to also gather feedback from members of the school community at large. SGCs have an opportunity to review the budget in one of our tools, an Allaview, and complete a two-round of sign-off prior to submitting their approval. And Deputy Foster's going to kind of dive into this a little more on a few slides ahead. But what I want to make sure is that we dive into what exactly is included in the starter budget, and what are the aspects of the school budget that are up for review, and also, right, that allows for those flexibilities. What exactly is up for discretion? So I'm going to tag you in, Deputy Foster, so that you can kind of go through some of the mechanics, if you will, of that starter budget.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. So what you see here, and we actually have 3 slides that I'm going to walk through that go over the contents of our equity-based starter budget. And I just want to loop back to something I heard the superintendent say, right? The most important word in that phrase is equity. What I'm going to talk about in terms of how we build the allocations for each individual school is based on ensuring we're providing each school what is needed based on the needs of the students in that school. So that sometimes that's the number of students, sometimes it's the specific needs of those students. And so I'll give you some examples of that as I walk through this. So I just want to, what you see on this first slide is the staff allocations per student. And so these are allocations of staffing that are based on the number of students in a particular school. And so obviously part of that equity-based formula is just larger schools are going to have more staffing needs than a smaller school. So for example, I'm not going to read all of these to you, but I'll give you some examples. Obviously, each school has a principal, each school has an assistant principal, but when a school gets larger, they may actually then have more than one assistant principal. If you go on down, for example, teachers, we also have in our contract with our teachers in Hartford, the contract stipulates how many students can be in a class. And so we allocate teachers based on the number of students, making sure we have enough teachers so that we're not having classes that are exceeding the class size requirements in the contract. So as you go down this list, you see other categories of staff. And again, most of these allocated on a per student basis. Some of them, there's other parts, right? With our student engagement specialists, the allocation is a function of those are staff who are dedicated to supporting our students who are struggling with getting to school, right? And getting to school regularly. And so that's based on the number of students in that category and the need of that particular school. And the last thing you see on here, I just want to explain what this is. You see stipends. And so that is for a variety of things where schools, educators are paid extra for things like coaching a sports team. And so schools need some funding in order to pay those stipends to their staff for the extra responsibilities they take on. And so that's what you see. So when I say stipends, think of coaching or being an advisor to an extracurricular club and those kinds of things. The other thing I want to highlight here is that schools, we call this the equity-based starter budget. And part of the reason for that language starter is that schools may have other resources through different kinds of grants that they may get from the state or from other sources. And so schools do have the ability to potentially add staff or add additional positions depending on available grant funding. So that's what makes this starter budget. So if we go to the next slide, what you see here are non-staff allocations, again, based on the number of students. And so what we've tried to do here is give you, so there's 4 categories of these non-staff allocations. You see supplies, you see a middle school social emotional learning supplement, a magnet supplement, and flexible dollars. And so these are categories where outside of staff, right, there's things that schools need. It could be art supplies, it could be books and materials. Sometimes it's buses for field trips or buses for athletics. And so this is where there's discretion at the building level about how these resources are used. And what we've done on the right here, where you see example expenses, these are the kinds of things that schools have used these allocations for. But that's a decision that's really, schools have a lot of latitude in terms of how this resource gets used. So if we go to the next slide, this is the last one on our equity-based starter budget. There are other expenses that are in a school's budget besides the ones on the previous 2 slides. And these can be staff, and they're things other than staff where it's not as simple as having a formula based on the number of students. And this is where that equity piece around responding to the needs of the particular building or the particular students being served by a school comes into play. So the first example is our paraeducators and our special education teachers, which you see as the first 2 rows here. It's not as simple as how many, because actually staffing of our special education teachers and our paraeducators is a function of the specific needs of our special education students, which is driven by each of our special education students has their individualized education plan, their IEP. And that document lays out what their educational needs are, and that varies from student to student. So it's not as simple as, we have 20 students with special needs and we can just churn out the number of teachers. It's a function of need. And as you go on down the list, you'll see similar things. So nursing, we obviously make sure we have nursing coverage in every school, but the medical needs of students vary from school to school. Custodians is a little different. That's based on the size of the facility as well as number of students, because a larger school requires more staff to maintain it, keep it clean. And so I won't go through all of these. The 2 at the bottom are examples of non-staff where, there's equipment like the copy machines in a building. And then there's utilities, right? Paying for the electricity or the heating of the building. Those are part of a school budget, but there's not a formula that generates that. It's based on the particular costs of a given school. So that's really the equity-based starter budget. So the next thing we want to do is just walk you through, well, where do school budgets go? Right? Because as you're thinking about the budget, and as we think about the budget and balancing a budget for 24-25, we have to think about where do all the resources go? And so this is actually based on our current year budget, so our 23-24 school budget. And this is doing an average across all of our schools, just to give you some context on where is the money spent in a school. And what you see here is that more than 90% of a school budget is staff, and then the fringe benefits for staff. And so when we say fringe benefits, we're talking about health insurance and retirement and things like that. And so that's really the vast majority, right? So we are investing in the people who are serving our students, right? That's the vast majority of our school budgets. And on the right, what you can see, as I mentioned earlier, that we allocate staff in order to meet the requirements, the class size requirements in our contract with our educators. And you can see those, they vary by grade level. So you can see those on the right. And that really is just to give you a sense of when we use the equity-based starter budget to determine staffing to a school, it's a function of enrollment, right? The total number of students, as well as the requirements for how many students should be in a class. On the next slide, this is just an example of a school budget. And so on an earlier slide where I was showing you the equity-based starter budget, what you were seeing is I gave you some examples of how schools might spend, particularly that non-staff money. So in things like instructional improvement, professional services. So when you get a chance to see like a draft budget for your school, it's going to look something like this. So you're going to see formula-based staff, right? Those are those staff that are determined on that per pupil basis using a formula that I talked about, and also, again, meeting those class size requirements. There's also going to be staff in there that are non-formula based staff. So you see in this example, 4 FTEs for special education, 1.5 for speech support for young people, 11 special education paraeducators. That's driven by the particular needs of the students served in that school. And then what you see highlighted in blue on the right, you know, as you think about your role as SGCs, those are really a lot of the categories of funding where there's some flexibility at the building level to think strategically about how do we want to use that money. And so those allocations I talked about, there's a flexible spending allocation and the middle school SEL supplement. Those resources get put into categories like instructional improvements, professional services, or instructional and other supplies, texts and library books. And so, you know, those are the areas where you can engage with the school and thinking about how do you want to use that money strategically to support student success in your school. So on the next slide, that was a lot of numbers. So I'm going to give us a break from all those numbers for a moment and just say, you know, one of the things that's important to understand when we go into this budget process is what are the things that actually can cause a change in a school's budget from one year to the next. So when you sit down as an SGC, and for example, when you sit down to take a first look at the budget for your school, you might notice, for example, this might not be true, but I'm going to give it as an example. You might notice that the initial budget for your school is less than the budget for last year. And what I want to show you here is what are some reasons. All right, so to make sure we're capturing all of this information. And so what you see is enrollment, right? So I already talked about a lot of our allocations are based on number of students. So if the number of students in the school decline from one year to the next, that's going to reduce the budget in some areas. I talked about student need as well. So if the needs of the particular students served in a school change, that's going to have a consequence for the budget. School priorities, and this is an area, again, where the SGC comes in, where, you know, when you look at those flexible dollars I talked about, where are the places that in your school you want to invest resource, right? That can change how the budget is allocated from one year to the next. And then revenue, right? So how much money do we have in total? And that's both a district thing, right? So one of the things that I think we're going to talk about in a few minutes is how much money do we have in total as a district, right? That has implications for the budgets in each school. But then also in your school, depending on the different grants that are available, we have grants that come from the state that go to some schools based on the particular needs in those schools. And so that has an implication for what you have available to spend in a given year. So the other thing you heard the superintendent mention is ESSER funds, which you see on the lower right here, or we also call them COVID relief funds. And so this was a program, it was multiple grants actually, that came out of as a result of the COVID pandemic. And so the federal government allocated a large number of resources to support schools and school districts with both navigating the pandemic when we were in the middle of it, right? Buying things like the personal protective equipment, the masks and things like that, that we all became all too familiar with. But it was also to invest strategically in recovery from the pandemic. So supporting students to regain some of what was lost academically over the course of the pandemic. So the important thing to know for this budget year is that all of that grant money ends, it expires at the end of this school year. So this year, and when I say this school year, I mean this 23-24 school year. At the end of this school year, we will not have access to this large pot of money that we had access to for the last 3 years. And so that has significant implications for our budget. And we're going to talk a little more about that this evening. But we just wanted you to see on this slide, what are the various things that can affect your school's budget, so that when you look at the budget and you see an increase or you see a decrease, these are some of the factors that might contribute to that. And I think I'm going to hand it back to the superintendent to walk us through some of those big picture topics around our funding.
Yeah, and before we dive into exactly what, what's the money coming in and from where, and how is it distributed, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide. It's the various sources of funding that make up our school budgets. And so there's a lot of detail here. So at a later time, you can kind of dig into it if you'd like to reference it. But I think the one important thing I would note is that there are various sources, with the bulk, however, the bulk of the funding coming from the state based on the number of students, right? That enrollment that Deputy Foster was talking about, the number of students that we have. Now, if we get to see this pie chart here, this is the allocation of our district budget. So you will see the bigger portion there, that blue to the right, it's about 57% of our budget is in what we call direct school-based expenses. Out of the remainder, another 27% of the budget is allocated towards transportation and tuition payments that we make to other school districts, right? Because if some of you remember, we are a school district of choice. We participate in the regional school choice system. And so we have to pay not just transportation, but the tuition. The remaining 16% is towards central office budgeted expenses. But even when we look at those central office expenses, right, within that group, a portion of those costs represent school-based staff that are paid out of the central office budget as well, right? So the percentage of that budget that is truly central office based is only 11.6% of the budget, right? But even within that, within those groups, right, finance, our Office of Talent Management, our performance management, our operations, communications teams, right, they all provide support to our schools. So examples of school-based staff that are paid through that central office budget, but work in schools, which is by the 4.4% of the overall budget. Examples include 22 health services personnel, 31 language, speech, and hearing personnel, 35 special education service personnel. Our academic coaches that provide support for our teachers, 31 of them come from that small portion. 29 buildings and grounds personnel. So in summary, approximately 90% of our budget is allocated directly to schools, school personnel, or services in direct support of students, like tuition, like transportation. Now, in this slide, I know that we tried to communicate a lot, but let me kind of unpack it here. It gives us an overview of revenue. Revenue is money coming in for the last 6 school years, including the current year, as well as a projection of our revenues for the next fiscal year, right? So these bars that you see are dividing into funding buckets: private or other, federal, state, local, and ESSER or COVID relief. So the modest increase in revenue in the middle of the graph, right, shown in that royal blue, represents that significant investment. With the expiration of those COVID relief funds at the end of this fiscal year, right, Hartford Public Schools will have almost the exact same amount of revenue in the 2024-25 year that we did back in 2018-2019 school year. And that is where that challenge lies. We think is a significant challenge, especially due to inflation, right, which we've all experienced, and has resulted in this cumulative price increase of about 20% since 2018. So $1 back in 2018 is worth about 80 cents now. The other aspect that complicates our current budget cycle and flat revenue is that we're still recovering from the pandemic. I don't know about you, but sometimes people tell me, oh, the pandemic is over. We're back. No, we're still recovering. So the investment in the ESSER funding did allow us to continue to establish a foundational support that we consider to be necessary, right? We weren't investing in like luxuries. These were foundation supports that we were able to invest in because of that relief funding. The numbers in the top right give you a sense of how significant that investment has been. While the next page, right, I'm going to go into, it gives you some specifics of what we've been able to fund with the money. So we can go into this slide here, and you see these are the details behind the ESSER relief funding investment. So currently 230 positions in our district are funded with those ESSER COVID relief funds they're incremental to that equity-based budget positions that Deputy Foster reviewed earlier. That includes staff that is responsible for social and emotional support, like social workers and classroom paraeducators. In instruction, that includes 35 resource teachers, coaches, and over 16 teachers that we hired to reduce classroom size, because earlier during the pandemic, we identified that reducing class size as one of the ways that we were going to accelerate and recover on academic outcomes for students. And it also included over 16 student engagement specialists and 3 family and community support providers who have all been so valuable in our efforts to improve attendance throughout the district. The programming is listed on the left, right? When you see programming, ranging from expanding learning opportunities. We've invested in esports and technology-based enrichment, high school career pathways that we know are proven to be successful in helping our students graduate and prepare for college and any success after high school. This is why we are going to have to make some really difficult decisions moving forward on behalf of our students, because a lot of what we invested in, we needed and we still need and we will still need. But we know that the revenue is not going to look the same. So we're going to do a quick review of some of the immediate next steps. We reviewed the comprehensive calendar, but to lift 3 items that you can just keep on your radar, we will be developing the equity-based budgets for each school based on those enrollment projections. Training resources are going to be available on the AlaView platform. So all of our SGC members are or should be comfortable navigating the platform so that they can view their school budget. And there will be an SGC, there will be SGC meetings with school leaders and staff, because we want everyone to have access to this information, so that at the school level, there can be discussions on priorities for the next fiscal year. So I'm going to pause there. I know that was a lot of information. And then we're going to see if I can pause to see the questions that came in.
Yeah.
Yes, Superintendent, we do have a few questions. You answered one of them, but I want to be mindful that not everyone was able to join at the same time. Would you mind giving that quick overview of what ESSER is that you gave at the beginning of the presentation?
Yes. So ESSER, or COVID relief funds, they were the pandemic relief funding that, right, so they came from the federal government to the state and then were allocated to school districts. and the funding expires at the start of next school year. So anything paid for with that ESSER pandemic relief funding, additional staffing, additional programs, right, will have to end, right? We cannot continue to fund it with other resources. So when we say ESSER, it's another way of saying COVID relief funding.
Great. Thank you. Deputy Foster, I think the next question you addressed, but again, I want to be mindful that not everyone was able to join. Can you give a list or an overview of the items in the school budget that are up for discussion and a list of things that are already in the budget so far? And I will give a reminder that we will share the presentation with everyone as well as the recording. But if you wouldn't mind touching on those, that would be great.
Sure. So I will start with the things that really, are relatively fixed, right? Some of them are things like utilities, right? What it costs for electric and gas, right? That's not something we can obviously eliminate. There's sort of equipment costs for things like copy machines and stuff like that. And then on the staffing side, we talked about the equity-based starter budget and the allocations. And so we have obligations to meet with much of our staffing in terms of whether it's making sure we are ensuring that our classes are not too large or ensuring that we have the right staff to meet the student needs identified in each individual educational plan for our students with disabilities. And so there's not a lot of, right, that equity-based starter budget and those allocations that come from that, we in many cases have to provide that staffing. Where the latitude comes in is two places. One is on some of the non-staff expenditures, where there are allocations of funds provided to a school. There's discretion within the school to make decisions about how those funds will be used. The other place is where there's additional revenue that could come from other grants that's not being used for things like the staffing that comes from the equity-based starter budget. Then there's latitude at the building level, and certainly within the constraints of the grant, right? Because when the state gives us a grant, there's certain expectations they have about how that money will be used. But with those grant funds and with some of the non-staff funding, there's latitude, and I should say, some of those grants do pay for additional staff as well. So there can be staffing over and above what comes from the equity-based starter budget, depending on the revenue available to a given school.
Great. Thank you very much. I'll give a reminder too, if anyone has a question, to please utilize the chat feature, and we'll be monitoring that. We did have a few other questions that came in regarding how parents can get involved. So the first one was, how can I as a parent learn and play an active role in our school's budgets? I'll start with you, Dr. Torres-Rodriguez.
Yeah, I would say continue to do what you're doing, which is participating in the SGC process. See if you can establish an upcoming meeting to preview your budget via the Allaview platform with your SGC and your school leader, school principal, so that you can understand what those elements that we reviewed today look like for your specific school.
Great, thank you. Next question on parent involvement. How can parents spread the word to get other parents more involved? Who would they talk to at the district and or at their specific schools?
I would say, so today is the first of multiple forums that we're going to be hosting on the budget process. So, we're going to continue to invite parents, but I ask that you do the same. Invite parents to join us for an upcoming meeting. You can attend an upcoming board meeting. We have a board workshop coming up as well to go over the budget. Share your voice, which matters to us. Certainly continue to reach out to your school-based administrator or the family and community support provider about maybe you want to host a family night or training on the budget, which any one of our team members would be willing to join you. Your school team can work with our communications department or the Office of Family and Community Partners to coordinate resources and share materials on the budget process for you or for other parents as well. There's several opportunities that we can either give you resources that you can facilitate, or we can also partner to help in this process. We want as many people as possible, not only informed about the process, but specifically able to give feedback to their school community on their specific budget.
Sorry, there's a question that's somewhat related to that, but it's specifically around financial participation. Can we help somehow? The person who asked the question said, I don't really like fundraisers, but I'm sure we have crafty parents who might be willing to make items to donate. In other words, how can we help the school?
Yes, well, I would say connect definitely with the school leadership, the school principal, check in to see who the PTA, PTO lead is, because there are certainly opportunities there. And those are funds, right, that directly, to directly impact that local school community.
Great. Deputy Foster, I believe this question is best addressed to you. How do we know what items in our school budget are funded by ESSER?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, I think that's something that we can make, when you have an SGC meeting and are looking in AlloView, you can actually see what is funded by what funding source. And so it'll really be in the detail of those meetings when you get into it. But I just want to emphasize another piece, which is that when we're talking about building the 24-25 budget, right, we won't have the ESSER or the COVID relief funding at all. So there's one answer to that question, which is that in the 24-25 budget, nothing will be funded by ESSER. But I understand the question to be what current programming or what current staffing in the school is funded through ESSER, and that should be visible in AlloView when you sit down to start having your SGC meetings.
So related to that, you talked about the next year's budget, Deputy Foster and Superintendent Torres Rodriguez. What happens to the 200 plus staff members that are funded by ESSER? Will our schools have fewer teachers in buildings because ESSER is expiring? What about paras? So
you want to start? Or you want me to start? Okay. So the answer, there's a couple parts to the answer to that question. So, given that the budget situation we're in, and that graph that the superintendent shared, where there is no question we'll have less money to spend in 24-25 than we have this school year. We will have less positions as a district in 24-25 than we have in 22-23. That's just the honest truth. However, in terms of the specific individuals whose positions might currently be funded by ESSER, one of the things that will be a very high priority for us as a district is, as we move through this process, if a particular position, we have turnover in our district, right? People retire or people take another job. And so it'll be a priority for us. If a particular position that's funded by ESSER is eliminated for the 24-25 budget, it will be a priority for us whenever possible to find a place for that staff member in the Hartford Public Schools, because we have that turnover. We can't promise that we're going to be able to do that in every case. And so I guess, the other part of the question, I guess, to be as specific as possible, like, will there be less staff in your child's school next year than there is this year? That is likely to be the case because we have additional staff in our schools that are funded, additional positions in our schools that are funded with a funding source that we will not have next year.
Somewhat related question, are there programs like art funded by ESSER?
We did not fund, we ensure that there are unified arts teachers across all of our schools through our equity-based starter budget. And we may have funded additional teachers in schools above what our equity-based starter budget provisions. But the end of ESSER will not mean that we're, I don't believe, eliminating those unified arts positions because they're part of that equity-based budget.
One thing I will add is that schools had the SEIGs, and so Scaling Equity Innovation Grant, that was actually in response to feedback that we heard from some of our parents and many of our school leaders, that they wanted to have flexibility. They wanted like a pot of money, if you would, to work on identifying things that they wanted to try out or do more of. And so each school got SEIG funds, and some schools I know invested in art programming. So I think it was a total of $11 million spread across all of our 39 schools and programs. And so there might be some program, after school program, I don't know specifically, that some of the schools might have. So I encourage you to ask your school principal about that one, because it might not be in terms of staffing, but it might be that it was, you know, a program that came in to work with students to put on a performance, for example, and that was paid by that SEIG.
I just want to add one more thing on the arts question. Just occurred to me to name that, you know, not all of our ESSER spending was on positions or things that will sort of go away. And so an example of that is actually this fiscal year, the district is taking $1 million of that, about $1 million of the ESSER, and spending it on art supplies and musical instruments. And those are things that will last beyond this year, right? If we buy a trumpet, we're going to have that trumpet for years. And so just to highlight that some of the strategic investments made with the ESSER will have a lasting impact in things like our arts programming.
Thank you. There's a question regarding school food. Deputy Foster, I think this, it might be a good opportunity to just talk about sort of what that process is for funding, and even maybe to articulate some of the grant work that is being done in connecting to local suppliers, but anything else that you'd want to address for that specific question.
Sure. And so one of the things you might have noticed in our presentation this evening is nowhere in the school budget did it mention food. And so the reason for that is actually our food service program is funded through a program through the U.S. Department of Agriculture that funds school breakfast and lunch programs nationally. And so part of that program, so we run, right, we provide breakfast and lunch to all our students every day. We have other programs sometimes that happen in the evening. That's all a self-contained program. So that program is entirely run off the funding that is received through the USDA school lunch program. And so that's why you don't see it in the budget. That's why you won't see it in the budget for your child's school, because that program exists. But to the point, to Jesse, your point, we do have an expanding program of work sourcing as much of food as we can locally. And the one thing that's really important to add in this conversation is, as part of receiving that funding from the USDA, there are a very clear set of nutritional guidelines that we are expected to follow that talk about at a very significant level of detail, right? How many servings of, for example, yellow vegetables versus orange vegetables versus green vegetables should be a part of a student's school lunches over the course of a week. And so our program is fully compliant with all of those requirements from the USDA. And we have to follow those requirements because the funding that supports our school lunch and breakfast program is dependent on following those guidelines from the USDA.
Thank you, Deputy Foster. There's a question in the chat, Dr. Torres Rodriguez, I think I'll give it to you first, about advocacy and just getting funding that would be to help our schools operate.
I love that question. And you know what I think is on multiple levels. One, I know that you know, we're trying to be vocal at the state level. Well, certainly with our Board of Education, so that our Board of Education can also join in our advocacy to talk to the state to see if there are additional funding. I'll name an example. I know that investments have been made on a grant that allows us to have added staff for our family and community support providers to go on home visits for students that are chronically absent, for example. So we can advocate, and we are advocating for continuation of those funds. But I also think that there's opportunity for us to work with our local government, right? Working in partnership with City Council, for example, to identify how can we have some of our community partners continue to provide some of the support and the resources that we, the district, have been paying for with ESSER funding that are not going away. Is there an opportunity for us to partner with the city, with local funders to, for example, continue to fund some of our community school programs that we have? So I think there's local advocacy, but I think there's also advocacy at the state level, because one of the things that I talked about earlier is it, like, for example, transportation and tuition. Part of that tuition that we pay is for, of course, for students that go to magnet schools that are operated by other operators. And when a student is, for example, a special education student, we have to pay the cost of that that service, and we do, but we don't get reimbursed at the exact the full amount by the state because of the way the formula is. And so, you know, say an example, if it costs $100 as an example to provide the services to this student, and we have to pay the full $100, but then the reimbursement that the state gives us is about $75. So the remaining gap, we have to come up with it, right? So it takes away from the money that would be left to invest in our students and in our schools. So I think there's advocacy there. That's why I appreciate that question, because there are multiple ways that we can go at it at the local and at the state level.
Thank you. There's a question about magnet school budgets. Dr. Torres Rodriguez, do you want to just sort of explain the difference between magnet school funding and our comprehensive neighborhood school funding?
Yeah, and I think that the one thing that's key here, and I see the question as to if the determining factor is the student in the enrollment, right? How do you go about that? And it's twofold. One is we try to look at patterns in enrollment in previous years. So we start with that, but then there's a lot of conversation that happens with the school leader and at the state level, because for some of you that might not be aware, we participate in the Regional School Choice Program, and there are very specific guidelines that are required for us to pay attention to. And so you know, how many students are coming from a low socioeconomic, you know, status or another town, all of those have different numbers attached to them, and that impacts the enrollment that a school can have. So we advocate to have as many students as possible so that, right, magnet schools can maintain the level of enrollment or increase the level of enrollment, which means more money, more funding. But we know that sometimes, you know, we are having to, you know, wait to see whether or not the state is going to approve, you know, the requests that we make. So that also actually turns into a lot of conversation back and forth. And it is a process that goes, well, we have some families that, you know, come into our district in September up until October 1st. But we want to maximize as many seats as possible.
Great. The last question that I see in the chat so far is, what investments and initiatives is the district using to reduce student and staff absences due to illness?
Superintendent, do you want me to, or you want to?
I'm sorry. Yes. Sorry.
Your cough is well timed with the question.
That was not planned.
Wait, I can take a pause. Let me try to answer that. There are several ways that we're trying to support staff, and that's really local. There's two ways. One, at the local level, we want to make sure that our school leaders are paying attention and being mindful of the needs that our staff have. So we have opportunities for staff to work with one another, to feel supported, and that looks different. That looks in a different ways. One is spaces that allow for staff to have their own reflection time, break to kind of gather and take a breather. But we also want to make sure that our leaders are creating conditions for staff to be supported. Some of what we hear from staff is that they need support to get better at their job, right? So that their own stress levels can decrease, because then they feel more confident in their job. So our coaches, for example, can play a role in that, supporting especially our new staff members with the new curriculum, how to support some staff with some behavioral challenges that might be happening in the classroom. The other thing that we do is we encourage staff to participate in wellness activities, either at the school site or district-wide as well. This is an area that I think we have to continue to get better at because, you know, we were, for example, this morning looking at how can we support staff with some of the behaviors that we know are challenging and that specifically at this time of the year can be a little more intense. And so making sure that we have mentors for staff, coaches for staff so that they can feel supported as well. And to the extent that as we get closer to winter, right, we're going to be mindful of any illnesses that are going around and trying to make sure that, you know, we allow our staff to also take care of themselves because we want our staff to be at their best so that, right, they can be at their best for our young people. Deputy Foster, I don't know if there's anything else that you want to add, but.
Superintendente, tenemos una pregunta en español.
Yes. Dime.
¿Qué podemos hacer como padres para conseguir más presupuesto para tener más maestros en las escuelas? Ya que sigue aumentando la cantidad de niños, pero tenemos menos maestros. Yo sé que usted tocó un poco en el tema anteriormente, por ejemplo, con las escuelas magnet, pero la pregunta llegó ahora.
Sí, so I'll answer in Spanish and then I'll answer in English as well.
Gracias.
Sí, una de las maneras es que tenemos que abogar, por ejemplo, abogar en términos de el presupuesto que se nos da a nivel local, en términos del municipio y también a nivel estatal. También vamos a seguir nosotros reclutando maestros. Por ejemplo, hay una fundación, se llama Travelers Foundation, y ellos sí tienen un compromiso y están dedicados a darnos recursos para que nosotros para seguir reclutando maestros y personal. The question was in regards to how can we have additional resources and funding to get additional teachers. And so we talked about that advocacy is important, not only at the local, but at the state level. But there are some foundations and funders that are going to invest in our recruitment efforts as well, so that we can support staff that are coming from, for example, the Caribbean or Puerto Rico. We know that Travelers Foundation has made a commitment to continue to support that work, that effort.
Gracias. Y tenemos otra, y esta va a ser la última porque estamos a las 6:29. Rapidito. Las escuelas tienen, ¿verdad? Saben si las escuelas tienen fondos para proveer intérpretes en persona para cada reunión de PPT que tengan los estudiantes.
Buena pregunta. Bueno, tenemos, y Viviana, tú puedes también dar información adicional. Tenemos en muchas de nuestras escuelas sí tenemos a personal que sí es bilingüe, sí es español que necesitan, y tenemos algunos creo que también hablan portugués, si no me equivoco. Así que tenemos en algunas de nuestras escuelas, pero también tenemos, ¿cómo se dice? La asistencia de traducción por la línea telefónica. Sé que tal vez no sea lo ideal, pero sí continuamos buscando manera de tener más presupuesto, más recursos para tener a personal que esté ahí disponible en la escuela a todo tiempo para traducir y proveer ese apoyo, específicamente durante esas reuniones para nuestros estudiantes que reciben servicios adicionales. The question was with regard to interpretation services, specifically for planning and placement team meetings for students that require special education services. And I explained that the majority of our schools do have bilingual staff members, but that is an area that we continue to seek resources and supports for, because we do agree and believe that we want to have someone there available at all times for our families. You know, we are prideful in that we have, I think, 85 now different languages represented throughout our district. But that creates a challenge for us as well, right? Because we would want to have interpreters available in person to meet the needs of all of those, right? 85 different languages, but that is really challenging for us to do. And so we're going to continue to try to get at improving that. But in the meantime, we do have available the language line that provides some support.
Great. Just to be mindful of time, we are at 6:30. So I'll turn it back to you, Dr. Torres Rodriguez, if there's any concluding remarks. Oh, I'm sorry, Deputy Foster.
I just wanted to offer a clarification. So a question that might be coming up is we've talked a little bit about AlloView, and we shared that there will be some resources available in learning how to use AlloView. I just want to make sure we're clear that what we're doing is all chairs of SGCs will be provided with access to AlloView, as well as the principals in each school. And so just wanted to clarify that and say that we're doing that automatically as we, as schools have shared with us the names of the chairs of the SGCs. But certainly if as we move through this process, if you're the chair of your SGC and you're not getting an email giving you access to AlloView, it should come to your email. Certainly reach out to your principal and they can let us know and we can work to rectify that.
So I'll close by thanking everyone for joining us, for your commitment, your leadership, and we want to hear your voice, your suggestions. This is probably the most challenging budget season that I have experienced, given the sunsetting of the ESSER, the COVID relief funding. And so I look forward to working in partnership to trying to work through and continue to provide the best that we can for our students and for our educators. So thank you for your partnership.